It seems like the Jets are going to be without Haason Reddick for the foreseeable future. The defense should still be good, but good and good enough might be two different things. Let's discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, August 14th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs have wound down, the sports have stopped sportsing like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Today, we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday, we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. And unsurprisingly, most of our questions this week are about Haason Reddick. And if you haven't been following, maybe you're on vacation and you haven't checked out the news. Earlier this week, Haason Reddick requested a trade from the New York Jets. He escalated his holdout. He was already holding out, seeking a new contract. Now he wants out. He wants a trade, which is quite interesting because, he hasn't participated in a practice yet as the member of the Jets. Might be the first time it's ever happened that the player's been traded to a new team and then wants a second trade before he even practices with his new team. So let's begin with our mailbag questions. Our first one, John. Even without Haason Reddick, I still feel pretty good about this Jets defense. There's still a lot of talent on the defensive line. The Jets seem pretty solid across the board on defense. How worried should I be? Well, I think it's a nuanced question because I think even without Haason Reddick, this defense is shaping up to be very good. And, we talk about this a lot on the show about the talent the Jets have at both the defensive line and the corner position. And to be fair, linebacker, I think after Quincy Williams' breakout last year and, the always reliable CJ Mosley still being in the mix, the Jets are very good at linebacker. But I've said this before, I'll say it again. If there are two spots you want to be good at in the NFL, it's defensive line and corner. And especially on defensive line, I'm talking about pass rushing, guys who can get after the quarterback. And the two of them kind of have like a symbiotic relationship. A good group of corners makes the defensive line better. A good defensive line makes a group of corners better because when you have guys who can get to the quarterback, when you have defensive linemen who can rush the passer, makes the cornerback's job easier. You don't have to cover for as long because the quarterback's, either got to get rid of the ball early or he's going to be on the ground. So you don't have to cover guys for 5 seconds. If you have corners who can lock down receivers, it gives the defensive line more time to get to the quarterback. And when you have both of these things, it can absorb a hit to one of the other units. There was a game the Jets played in 2022 against the Detroit Lions, and Quinn and Williams missed that game. And you could tell it was very clear that the Jets were not controlling the point of attack as well as they normally did without Quinn and Williams in the lineup. But Detroit still struggled to score. Now, they ended up winning the game on a long touchdown on a 4th down play. But if you look at the Jets' defensive performance over the entire course of that game, it was quite good because the Jets had what they needed to absorb a hit and still play effectively. I think if you're on a defense with Sauce Gardner and on a defense with Quinn and Williams, and along with all the secondary players the Jets have, you're not going to struggle. You're not going to be bad on defense. But, I think we're, and this is something that's true of the Jets fan base in general, we have to get used to like the new mindset because in the past, we've just been trying to not be the worst in the league. And anything that's not the worst in the league has been, we can live with that. We're in good shape if we're not the worst in the league because that's where the Jets have been, 13 straight years of not making the playoffs. It's a new day with the New York Jets. And there's a new mindset. And the Jets are talking about winning big this year. Jets are talking about, can we be a contender? And when you're a contender, it's not just about avoiding the bottom. It's not even just about being good. You have to maximize everything. If you want to win a Super Bowl, you have to be as good as humanly possible. And this is where I think Reddick, the loss of Reddick hurts because the defense can be good, but Reddick's a difference maker. He's a guy who takes it to the next level. And like if your objective is to not be the worst team in the NFL, the Jets have enough to do that. If your objective is to be a good defense, if your objective is to be a top 10 defense, the Jets have enough to do that. If your objective is to win the Super Bowl, I'm not going to say the Jets can't win the Super Bowl with Haason Reddick out, But adding Haason Reddick makes it much more likely because you're going up against the best of the best, and you got to maximize your team. And yeah, your defense is good, but Haason Reddick makes it better. He makes it a lot better. So that's where the impact comes in. It's not, it's not just about can the Jets defense be serviceable. It's not just can the Jets defense be good. It's do the Jets have the pieces in place to be the best team in the NFL? Because that's the objective this year. So that's where I think it hurts. I think another area where it hurts is that you have to remember that the 2023 defensive line, that's not the baseline right now because you lost a lot of production this offseason with Huff leaving and with JFM being traded. So I think the objective is that Haason Reddick and hopefully the development of Will McDonald will at least equal, if not surpass. And I think the objective is to surpass what the Jets got from Huff and JFM a year ago. Because I don't know why you get rid of 2 quality players if you don't think you can improve it. So without Reddick around, you have to remember that there's a lot of production that went out the door on the defensive end position, and Reddick was supposed to not only replace that but surpass it. So you lost a lot if Reddick's not in the lineup. You've downgraded the defensive end spot because Jermaine Johnson's good, but Jermaine Johnson was here last year. McDonald, you're hoping he's good. He could be good, but that's not the same as, knowing he's good. That's not the same as knowing that he's going to be great. And, I still don't understand why they traded John Franklin Myers. Now the Jets, they've fed reporters the idea that they had to do it to fit the salary cap. That's not true. They did not need to trade John. There were other ways they could have cleared cap space beyond trading JFM. So the idea that this had to happen, now it was one way to clear the cap space, but the idea that this was the only option they had, that's just not true. I don't know any other way to say it. The Jets had other ways. They could have restructured his contract and cleared about 80% of the cap space they cleared from trading him. Now they would have taken a bigger hit in the future, but I don't entirely understand. We hear all in, and you trade this high quality defensive end for nothing really, for a 6th round pick. And I don't and I got to say, if JFM was here, I would feel a lot better about the Jets' ability to weather the storm without Reddick. Now, again, I think this is a relative term. This is relatively speaking. I still think the Jets' defense is going to be very good, but I would have a lot more confidence if we had a Jermaine JFM starting duo at the defensive end spot with Reddick out, and then McDonald's your third guy. I feel a lot better about that than what we got now, which is Jermaine is your number 1 defensive end. McDonald is number 2, which could work out, and I'm hopeful it will work out. I wrote an article yesterday on GangGreenNation.com about the style of McDonald's play if you're interested. But then Michael Clemens is your number 3 guy. Suddenly, this defensive line is at the defensive end spot. That's not looking like a major strength. It's looking like you got one excellent player in Jermaine, a maybe in McDonald, and a hopefully in Clemens. That's different from last year. It's not as good. Now you still have Quinnen in the middle of the defensive line. Defensive line's fine. That's not a great defensive line anymore. That's not a top tier defensive line anymore. And again, with the corners you've got enough to shut teams down. But when you're in the playoffs against the Cincinnatis of the world and the Kansas Cities and the Buffaloes and the Baltimores, I don't know that with that, and hopefully Reddick will be back by then. But in a world where Reddick doesn't return, and that's becoming more likely, I'm not prepared to say Haason Reddick is never going to play for the Jets, but I think the odds increase by the day with each escalation by Reddick. It's a hit. I don't think there's any way around it. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk more about the implications of losing Haason Reddick. Not many people are thinking about the finances. What happens if Reddick doesn't play to the Jets salary cap? We'll go into detail on that continuing here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop, but the playoffs have wound down. Now the Olympics are over. What a bummer that is. I love the Olympics. And now we have fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel helps us keep the sports going whenever we want. All we have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime we're in the mood. It is still baseball season. Got the Yankees. We got the Mets. If you're a fan of another team, you got that going. And football's right around the corner. We're just we're about a month away from the Jets kicking off the 2024 season. They are underdogs week 1 Monday night in San Francisco. And FanDuel is the place to get in on the action because this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to fanduel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question: is there any cap relief associated with Reddick's fines and or possible missed game checks? Would the Jets get that cap relief this year or next year? So, I did a lot of research on this to figure out, and I looked at past situations like the Le'Veon Bell holdout with the Pittsburgh Steelers back in 2018. So I did my best to try and find the current rules on this. So the fines do not impact the salary cap. Reddick's going to be fined. I think it's like $50,000 a day. That has no impact on the salary cap. What could impact the salary cap is if Reddick misses games. And if you're not familiar with the way players are paid in the NFL, you have what's known as base salary. And the base salary is exactly what it sounds like. It's your salary. And that is paid to players after each game. So essentially your salary, if it's a $10 million salary, you get a check after every game for 1/17 of that $10 million. So essentially your salary is cut into 17 slices, and you get a check after every game. And that's different from bonuses. Bonuses are like a signing bonus is something the team pays you for signing. You get that check up front. You don't have to wait for the games for that. Which, by the way, is why players want big signing bonuses, because they want the money up front. They don't have to wait for the autumn to play games. If Reddick misses games, then yes, the Jets will be credited the salary cap space for any game that he misses. So each game he misses, the Jets will get a credit of 1/17 of his salary of roughly $14.5 million. It depends on how many games he sits out. So yes, there would be some salary cap relief for the New York Jets. And you have to remember that you can roll unused cap space from one year to the next. So any salary cap space the Jets do not spend in 2024, they can roll over to 2025, and that becomes extra cap space they have in 2025. So the best way to think about the salary cap is that every dollar you pay a player will eventually count against the salary cap. Now, there are accounting tricks. It's kind of similar to like using your American Express or Visa card. If you're out at a restaurant, you buy a meal for $50, you put it on your card. So that means you bought the meal. You haven't necessarily paid for it yet. You may pay for it down the line. And it's kind of the same thing in the NFL, where you may pay a player $5 million this year. His cap number may be $1 million this year. The other $4 million will eventually count against your salary cap. You eventually have to pay for every dollar you pay a player against the cap. So that's the way it is. And so you can do these cap gymnastics, but because if Reddick does not play in these games, he will not be paid. And if Reddick is not paid, then the Jets don't owe him anything against the cap for games he doesn't play. So that's kind of how that works. I hope that's a clear explanation for that. Our next question is from Taylor. Hey, John, as this Reddick situation has festered, I had originally saw it as a fireable offense for Joe Douglas. However, the longer I sat on this, I remember the ultimate blame has to go to Woody Johnson, who for decades has encouraged a toxic team culture of chasing headlines and good press over actually building a winning culture. My question: do you think Douglas should be fired at this point, and who do you think is more to blame for this disaster? Well, I think big picture, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's very difficult to defend the job Woody Johnson has done as owner, and I think you're absolutely right that Woody Johnson chases headlines. The problem is that Woody Johnson, I think, views headlines and building a team that wins on the field as like interchangeable. I think he views them as the same thing. And in many instances in the NFL, they're kind of like at odds. Like the things that get you headlines aren't necessarily the things that win you games, but Woody doesn't realize that Woody thinks it's the same thing. Woody thinks winning the offseason will lead to winning games in the autumn. I think in this situation, though, it's Joe Douglas's fault. And look, you want to put blame on Reddick for how he's handled things. I'm open to that discussion, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a 100% Joe Douglas or a 100% Reddick. There could be blame to go around, but I don't think you can say Joe Douglas can be absolved here for this simple standpoint. And I talked a lot about this on yesterday's show. It's clear that there is a difference in between how Joe Douglas values Reddick and how Reddick values himself. And that's something that needed to be addressed before this deal was made. You can't trade for a player when you're this far apart, when the team and the player view his value as this different. And that's where I think you got to blame Douglas. Should Joe Douglas be fired right now? I mean, I don't know what purpose it would serve. Look, I was as hard on Mike McCagnon as anybody. I don't know what the point of firing him after the draft was in 2019 because the timing of it just made no sense. There was really nothing gained by firing Mike McCagnon in 2019 at the time the Jets did it. The team is built right now. Joe Douglas is going to, Joe Douglas has done 95% of the work. I mean, this is his product. I don't have an issue like letting him see it through. Should Joe Douglas have survived 2023? I would argue no. I don't think Joe Douglas has done enough in his tenure with the Jets to deserve to continue to be the GM. And when I say that, people hear me say I don't think Joe Douglas deserves to be here, and they seem to view that as me they seem to view that as me being the same as me saying Joe Douglas is the worst GM who ever lived. They seem to view that as me saying Joe Douglas is an awful GM. And I'm not saying these things. Joe Douglas is not the worst GM in the NFL history. I don't even try and say he's an awful GM. There are some things he's done that have been excellent. The 2022 draft class, the Jamal Adams trade, the Sam Darnold trade, Michael Carter II drafting him. Joe Douglas will leave the team better than he found it. And again, there are some outstanding things Joe Douglas has done as GM of the Jets. When I say, he shouldn't be here, that's not me saying he's done nothing right. That's not me saying he's not better than he's better than Mike McCagnon, better than John Idzik. I don't think he's done enough good, though. And there have been a lot of glaring issues. There have been a lot of glaring problems with the job Douglas has done. And look, he has not put a winning team on the field. The quarterback he drafted second overall was, an all-time bust. And last year you could say the Aaron Rodgers gets injured. What's Douglas supposed to do? The problem with that, though, is that it's not a normal situation where the team loses its starting quarterback in the first game. The guy who went in, the guy you're blaming for losing the season, it was the guy Douglas drafted second overall. So that's a tough one for me. I think that's a really tough one because, it's not like this is a normal backup quarterback. This is the quarterback who was brought in by this GM to be the quarterback of the future. But that said, at this point in time, this is Douglas's show. We're going to have, who's going to take over as the interim GM for the season? And, it just, I don't think there's any point to it. You might as well play this out. And look, there have been GMs in the NFL who have struggled their first couple of years, who have not done a good job, and who have eventually figured it out. And I think that's got to be the hope with Douglas right now, because, look, if I was in charge, I would not have brought him back for 2024. But I think that, at this point, I don't think there's anything gained by throwing him overboard. That's just kind of how I feel at this point in August. What's it really going to accomplish? If the team's bad this year, he's going to get fired anyway, because, he's at the end of his contract. And if the team's good this year, if the team's really good this year, maybe it's a sign that he's turning the corner. Certainly can hope that. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention away from Haason Reddick for a little bit. This is a rule change that interests a lot of fans. It's actually not the kickoff rule. Everybody talks about the kickoff rule. There's another rule change in the NFL that's generated some attention. I'll give you some thoughts on that continuing here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself, and it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show today. Let's continue. Our next question is about the new hip drop tackle rule. This is an interesting question. John, do you feel the hip drop tackle being outlawed will lead to the missed broken tackle rate increasing this year? And yeah, so if you haven't been following over the offseason, they changed the rules on what sort of tackles are allowed, and what's known as the hip drop tackle has been taken out of the league. Whenever there's a big rule change about something in this area, there's always a lot of concern about how it's going to impact the game. But one thing I've found is that the players are pretty smart and pretty resilient, and coaching staffs are also pretty smart and pretty resilient. And they figure out ways to work around it. They figure out like a new if and when one technique is outlawed, they figure out a new technique to utilize. I mean, there are plenty of examples of this through the recent history of the NFL. I mean, you can talk about when they took out the horse collar tackle, players adapt. They figure out new ways to do things. I mean, every couple of years, there's some emphasis on there's some emphasis on making sure pass interference gets called, and there's always a lot of panic when that sets out. But teams adjust. They figure out ways to teach players techniques. And yeah, maybe like at the beginning of the year, there's like a flurry of early penalty calls, but eventually players figure out different ways to do things. So yeah, I'm not overly worried about it. I think that you'll see teams adapt. I think it's really that simple. Our next question, John, who's your favorite Jets radio announcer? Some good ones: Spencer Ross, Howard David, Merle Harmon, Charlie Steiner. Yes, some of those were before my time. Like I remember, I know Charlie Steiner was a Jets radio announcer. I remember him more for his time on SportsCenter with ESPN, especially those commercials. I mean, the Y2K commercial was hilarious. Howard David was great, but I've got to go Bob Wischusen. Bob Wischusen's been the Jets, the current guy. He's been there over 2 decades. I think he does a great job. I think he's phenomenal. So. Yeah, you're right. The Jets have had a lot of really good radio announcers, some before my time that my dad's told me about. But I think that Bob Wischusen's I just think he does a great job. I think he's very professional, does an outstanding job. And our last question is from Chris. Hi, John. I think it's pretty safe to say that the millions of John B fans out there would want to hear your true inner thoughts on how the Jets could conceivably lose out on the younger Bryce Huff at $17 million a year and end up paying Reddick more than if they gave him a new contract, while also giving up a 3rd-round pick. Well, yeah, I wish I had millions of fans, Chris. Look, what I'd say is, first of all, that I'm not ready to judge this Reddick, to put a final grade on this Reddick thing, because Haason Reddick's a great player, and I still have – look, I'm becoming more doubtful by the day. I'm becoming more skeptical by the day that this thing's going to be worked out. I was a lot more confident a week ago that this was going to work out fine. I was a lot more confident a month ago, 2 months ago, that Reddick and the Jets would eventually figure this thing out. But I still have hopes that this is going to work out. That said, look, I think I've been pretty consistent on this show through the years, well before, years before this Reddick Huff thing came out, that a couple of my philosophies are: one, when you have young ascending talent, you lock that up. You keep your young quality players in-house. You don't let them leave, because they've shown that they fit your locker room. They've shown that they fit your system. Another thing that I have been very vocal on is that you've got to be careful when you're chasing these big names, because they don't have loyalty to your team. They're chasing every last dollar, and sometimes they aren't the best fit for you, for your club, for your locker room. And again, I hope that this Reddick thing works out. And listen, there are instances where you pay a young guy and it doesn't work out for you. There are instances where you let a young guy go and it proves to be the right move. There are instances where you bring in the big name and it works out really well for you. These are not ironclad rules. These are just general thoughts about how you should build a team, more for general philosophies for team building. The Jets certainly cut against those philosophies when they let Huff leave and they brought in Reddick. They let the young ascending guy go and they brought in the big name. And obviously, so far, I think you're seeing some of the pitfalls in that approach. Now, we haven't played any games yet, so I'm not ready to pound my chest and say that I was right about Huff, or that this Reddick thing's a failure. I think I always say, another thing I say at this time of year is that it is a long story. It's like reading a novel. That's the story of the NFL season. So I'm not ready to make definitive proclamations about should the Jets have kept Huff yet. Yes, look, I was vocal at the time. I was vocal through last year. I felt that the Jets should keep Huff. And based on the contract he got, it would be different if Huff was getting $30 million a year. If Huff got an insane deal, then maybe I'd feel differently. I feel like the contract Philadelphia gave him seems like a pretty good value contract for them. Reddick, I really don't like the idea of giving up a day 2 pick for a guy who's a 1-year rental, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that was the Jets' plan for Reddick, because it doesn't seem like they ever had any ideas of extending him, at least in the early stages of this. And I don't I'm not sure I understand why you would trade for a guy like Reddick if you were not open to extending him. It's not like this is a guy who needs to establish himself. This is a guy who's already a high-end player in the last year of his contract, a guy who's one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. I'm not sure I understand why you'd trade for him if you were not willing to extend him, because whether or not you thought he was going to take things this far, and I did not, and I'm sure the Jets did not, he wants a new contract. So there are a lot of things that I question the Jets on right now. But I'm willing to let this play out a little bit longer. Now, when we get to December, maybe these are things I'll be saying, because these are things that certainly how it looks right now, but how it looks right now is not always how things end. So I never want to prematurely judge something. I think I've been very clear and very consistent. This is not just me inventing things to criticize the Jets. These are things I've said through the years. These are general philosophies I've had. I think you'll find them very consistent if you go back through time, that I've said in general, these are the things you should do. It's not the way the Jets went. I hope it works out. And we'll find out by the end of the season. And by the end of the season, I'll probably have more definitive thoughts on what the Jets have done. And I hope that my thoughts are that the Jets made the right move. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show or listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.